Picture this. You're 12 years old, home alone for the first time. Pizza's on the way. Video games are loaded. Life is perfect. Then the delivery driver asks you one question that changes everything. You alone here. Now imagine that same night, hours later, you hear footsteps inside your house. Someone who knows you're vulnerable. Someone who's been watching. Someone who's coming for you. Tonight, we're diving deep into something that terrifies us all at our core. The violation of our safe spaces. The places where we should feel most protected. But what if I told you that the scariest part isn't the intruder themselves? It's what happens in your mind during those moments of pure terror. The psychological warfare that plays out when a stranger invades your sanctuary. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these experiences create trauma that lasts decades, why certain details become burned into memory forever, and what actually happens in your brain when you realize you're being hunted in your own home. We're going to analyze 3 real documented cases of home invasion scenarios, breaking down the psychological elements that make them so disturbing. But more importantly, we're going to explore the science behind why these experiences fundamentally change people, why a simple knock on the door can trigger panic attacks years later, why certain sounds become permanently associated with danger, and why the human mind sometimes struggles to accept what's happening even when the threat is undeniable. Part 1. The psychology of first exposure. Let's start by understanding what happens in a young mind when safety is shattered for the first time. There's a concept in psychology called the security baseline. It's the foundation of trust we build about our environment from childhood. When you're 12 years old, your home isn't just a building. It's the center of your universe. It's where you've grown up, where you feel invincible, where nothing bad can happen because your parents have always been there to protect you. The first case we need to examine involves that exact moment when the security baseline fractures. A young person, newly trusted to be alone, experiencing what should be a milestone of independence, playing video games, ordering pizza, living the dream of every preteen. But here's what makes this scenario psychologically devastating. The threat doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from someone who had legitimate access to the home, someone who was invited to the door, someone who was given information, perhaps innocently, that created vulnerability. When the pizza delivery person asks if you're alone, something instinctive triggers in most people, even children. We call this the predator recognition response. It's an evolutionary mechanism that alerts us when someone is gathering information they shouldn't need. Think about it. Why would a delivery driver need to know if you're alone? The transaction is simple: pizza for money. But that question introduces a variable that has nothing to do with the transaction. It's information gathering. It's threat assessment from the other direction. What happens in the brain during this moment is fascinating and terrifying. The amygdala, your brain's fear center, immediately activates. But in a child, the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational decision-making and threat assessment, isn't fully developed. So there's this internal conflict. The child knows something is wrong, but doesn't have the full cognitive toolkit to process why or how to respond. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The feeling that something is dangerous, but the inability to fully articulate or act on that feeling. Now let's talk about what happens next in this scenario, because this is where the psychological horror intensifies exponentially. Time passes. The threat seems to have passed. The child has eaten, returned to their safe activity, their video games, their comfort zone. The brain begins to regulate to return to baseline. This is called threat de-escalation, and it's a natural process. Our bodies can't maintain high alert indefinitely. We have to come down. We have to relax. And that's exactly when predators strike. The doorbell rings again, but this time there's no legitimate reason for it. No expected visitor, no delivery, just a voice claiming to need help. Here's where we need to understand something crucial about predator psychology. The request for help is one of the oldest manipulation tactics in human history. It triggers our social bonding instincts, our empathy, our desire to be helpful. Even when we're afraid, especially when we're young, we're conditioned to help people who ask for it. This creates an enormous internal conflict. The child knows opening the door is dangerous, but refusing help feels wrong, feels cruel, feels like breaking a fundamental social rule. But the real psychological warfare begins when the person outside realizes they've been seen, when they know the child is aware of their presence. Because now it's no longer about stealth, it's about intimidation, it's about power. The banging on the door, the continued pleas, these aren't genuine cries for help. They're tests, they're measurements of resistance. They're psychological pressure designed to break down decision-making and create panic. Let's examine what happens in the child's mind at this point. There's a concept called acute stress response, commonly known as fight or flight. But in children, there's often a third response that we don't talk about enough: freeze. The body's systems become so overwhelmed that movement becomes impossible. Decision-making shuts down. The child becomes an observer in their own life, watching events unfold but feeling disconnected from them. This is actually a protective mechanism. When fight or flight aren't options, when you're overpowered or trapped, the brain protects itself by creating psychological distance from the trauma as it happens. The decision to call a parent to reach out for help represents a crucial psychological moment. It's the child's brain overriding the freeze response and taking action. But even this action is complicated by fear. Fear of overreacting, fear of being wrong, fear of getting in trouble. These secondary fears can actually delay help seeking, and predators often count on this. They count on victims second-guessing themselves, wondering if they're making too big a deal out of something, hesitating just long enough for the predator to gain advantage. When the parent confirms the danger is real, something shifts in the child's psychology. The fear is validated. This is important because validation allows the brain to move from confusion into pure survival mode. The parent becomes a lifeline, a tether to safety even though they're not physically present. This is why the instruction to stay quiet, stay hidden, becomes so powerful. It gives the overwhelmed mind a concrete task, a way to feel some control in a completely uncontrolled situation. Now we reach the moment that creates lasting trauma, the sound of someone inside the house, not outside asking to come in, not knocking or banging, inside, walking around, searching. This represents the complete destruction of the security baseline we talked about earlier. The home is no longer safe. The locks have failed. The barriers have been breached, and the child is now prey being hunted in the place where they should be most protected. Part 2, the watcher in the woods. Let's shift our focus to a different but equally disturbing psychological phenomenon: the feeling of being watched. This is something that goes beyond simple paranoia. It's rooted in deep evolutionary psychology, and when it's real, when someone actually is watching you, it creates a unique form of psychological torture that can persist for years. Consider a scenario where someone moves to a remote location. Isolation in itself isn't frightening to most people. In fact, many seek it out. The appeal of living deep in nature, away from crowds, away from noise, represents freedom to many. But isolation also means vulnerability. It means that if something goes wrong, help isn't close. This is a calculated risk that people accept when they choose remote living. What they don't anticipate is that isolation also means witnesses disappear. It means someone with bad intentions has time, has privacy, has control. The sensation of being watched is called scopophobia when it becomes a phobia, but the feeling itself is universal and deeply rooted. Our ancestors survived because they could sense predators even when they couldn't see them. We developed an incredible sensitivity to gaze direction, to subtle movements in peripheral vision, to the feeling of eyes on us. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that we actually can detect when we're being watched, even unconsciously. Our brain picks up on environmental cues too subtle for conscious awareness. But here's what makes this scenario so psychologically complex. When you feel watched but can't confirm it, you enter a state called hypervigilance. Your threat detection systems remain activated constantly. You're scanning, assessing, monitoring every shadow, every sound, every change in your environment. This state is exhausting. It depletes cognitive resources. It makes sleep difficult. It creates irritability and anxiety. And worst of all, it makes you doubt yourself. Am I paranoid? Am I overreacting? Is this real? This self-doubt is particularly insidious because it prevents action. If you can't prove the threat is real, you can't justify the fear to others or even to yourself. You become trapped between your instincts screaming danger and your rational mind saying there's no evidence. This creates enormous psychological stress. And again, predators often understand this intuitively. They know that uncertainty is its own form of torture. When the watched person finally sees the watcher, something profound happens psychologically. First, there's validation. I'm not crazy, this is real. But immediately following validation comes a much darker realization. This has been happening. All those times I felt watched, I was right. How long has this been going on? What else have I missed? This retroactive fear, the realization that you've been vulnerable without knowing it, can be more traumatic than the immediate threat itself. Let's talk about the specific psychology of the watcher's behavior in this scenario. The smile, the direct eye contact, the knife tapped gently against glass. These aren't attempts to break in immediately. They're displays of power. They're psychological games. The watcher is communicating several things simultaneously. I can see you. I can reach you. I'm not afraid of you. And most disturbing, I'm enjoying this. This type of predatory behavior falls into a category psychologists call power reassurance. The predator isn't primarily motivated by what they'll take or who they'll hurt. They're motivated by the feeling of control, by the fear they create, by the power differential they establish. This is why they don't simply break in immediately. The anticipation, the stalking, the psychological torture is part of the goal itself. The victim's response to freeze, to back away slowly, to not make sudden movements, represents another evolutionary survival mechanism. When dealing with predators in nature, sudden movement triggers chase response. The brain knows this instinctively. So despite overwhelming fear and the desire to run screaming, the victim instead moves carefully, trying not to escalate, trying not to trigger attack. But here's where this scenario takes an even darker psychological turn. The watcher doesn't leave. They follow. They move with the victim from window to window, maintaining eye contact, maintaining presence. This is called persistent pursuit, and it's designed to break down psychological defenses. Each time the victim thinks they've escaped, the predator reappears. This creates a sense of inevitability, of inescapability. It communicates that nowhere is safe, that no action will help, that resistance is futile. The decision to tell parents represents a crucial moment of vulnerability. For a teenager or young adult, admitting fear can feel like admitting weakness. There's social pressure to handle things independently, to not overreact, to be tough. The victim's initial framing, that maybe they need psychiatric help rather than the situation being real, shows how powerful this social conditioning is. They're more willing to question their own sanity than to assert that they're in danger. When the parent validates the experience by revealing there's been a pattern of break-ins in the area, multiple psychological shifts occur. Relief that it's real and recognized. Terror at realizing this is part of a pattern, meaning the predator is experienced, successful, has done this before. And anger at not having been warned earlier. This last emotion is important because it represents the victim's psychology trying to regain some control. If I had known, I could have been prepared. The truth is, preparation might not have helped, but the feeling of having been denied information, of having been kept vulnerable through ignorance, compounds the trauma. Now let's examine what happens psychologically when the immediate threat seems to pass but the predator remains nearby. The tapping sounds night after night. The footsteps on the roof, the sense of being monitored continuously. This creates what's called chronic stress response. Unlike acute stress, which spikes and resolves, chronic stress maintains elevated cortisol levels over extended periods. This has profound effects on mental and physical health. Sleep becomes disrupted. Immune function decreases. Cognitive abilities diminish. The person exists in a constant state of partial fear, never fully relaxed, never fully safe. The psychological impact of this sustained stalking is actually worse than a single violent encounter in many ways. A single attack, while traumatic, has a beginning, middle, and end. The brain can process it as a complete event, but ongoing stalking creates unresolved trauma. The threat remains open-ended. The fear has no resolution. The brain can't move into processing and healing because the danger is ongoing. Winter's arrival in this scenario introduces a new psychological element. Snow tracks. Suddenly, the invisible becomes visible. The suspected becomes confirmed. The psychological becomes physical evidence. This would seem like it should help, like having proof would reduce fear. But actually, it often increases it, because now you know exactly how close they came. You can see them circling your home, stopping at every window, searching for entry points, searching for you. The parent's decision to leave their child alone even after these events, armed with a shotgun, represents a complex calculation. It shows trust in the child's ability to protect themselves, but it also represents a form of trauma exposure. The child must now face their fear directly rather than being shielded from it. This can go two ways psychologically. It can create empowerment and confidence, the sense that I survived, I protected myself, I'm capable. Or it can create deeper trauma, the sense that I was abandoned to face danger alone, that I can't rely on others for protection. The presence of the dog introduces an interesting psychological element. Animals don't second-guess their instincts. When the dog reacts, it provides external validation that the threat is real. The dog isn't experiencing pareidolia, isn't being paranoid, isn't overreacting. Its response is pure instinct. This gives the human victim permission to trust their own instincts, to stop questioning whether the fear is justified. The footprints circling the house the next morning represent a form of psychological warfare that's particularly cruel. The predator is showing that they know the layout, that they've studied every entry point, that they've been there while you slept, while you were most vulnerable. This violation of privacy, this demonstration of access, creates a sense that nowhere is private anymore, that you're never truly alone. The final confrontation, armed with a weapon, represents the victim reclaiming power. The warning shot, the unleashing of the dog, these are actions of agency. They're the victim refusing to remain prey. Psychologically, this is crucial for recovery. Even though the threat may have ended anyway, even though the predator might have given up on their own, the act of fighting back, of taking action, helps the brain process the trauma as something survived through strength rather than something endured through helplessness. Part 3. Collective trauma and group dynamics. Now let's examine what happens when the violation of safety occurs not to an individual but to a group. This introduces completely different psychological dynamics. Group trauma has elements of both shared experience and individual isolation. Everyone experiences the same events, but each person's internal response is unique. This can either strengthen bonds or create fractures, depending on how the group processes what's happening. Consider a scenario where a group of friends travels to a remote location for vacation. The psychology of group travel already has interesting elements. There's shared excitement, collective anticipation, the feeling of adventure. But there's also diffused responsibility. When you're in a group, you unconsciously assume others are monitoring for danger, that someone else is being vigilant, that you don't have to maintain high alert individually because the group provides safety in numbers. This diffusion of responsibility is what predators who target groups often exploit. They understand that groups feel safer, are less cautious, are more likely to ignore warning signs because they trust in collective judgment. When someone in the group expresses concern, others often minimize it to maintain the group's positive mood. Nobody wants to be the person who ruins the fun, who overreacts, who causes unnecessary worry. The choice to stay in an obviously problematic location, despite warning signs, demonstrates how group dynamics override individual judgment. If one person suggests leaving, but others want to stay, the social pressure to conform can be overwhelming. Leaving alone means excluding yourself from the group experience, admitting fear while others show bravery, potentially being mocked or minimized afterward. It's often easier to stay despite danger than to break from group consensus. When the first threatening event occurs, the watcher at the window, group psychology becomes complex. Some members will want to immediately address the threat aggressively. Others will want to minimize it, to find explanations that make it less frightening. Others will want to leave immediately. This divergence in response can create conflict within the group at exactly the moment when unity is most important. The decision to stay after the first night, despite clear evidence of danger, represents a collective failure of threat assessment. But it's a failure rooted in completely understandable psychology. The group has invested in this experience financially and emotionally. Leaving feels like failure, like letting the threat win, like wasting the trip. There's also a phenomenon called normalcy bias, where people underestimate the probability of danger even after initial evidence, because their brains want to believe everything will be fine. The escalation to the predator being inside the house represents the complete failure of all protective measures. For a group, this is particularly destabilizing because it means the collective safety net has failed. If the group couldn't protect its members, what good was the group? This creates individual feelings of vulnerability, of being let down, of being unable to trust others for protection. The predator's behavior, standing in the kitchen staring at the refrigerator, introduces a deeply disturbing element. It suggests cognitive impairment or mental illness, which makes the predator even more unpredictable and therefore more frightening. A rational predator might be reasoned with, might follow certain patterns, might have certain goals, but someone who appears not fully connected to reality is completely unpredictable. Their behavior doesn't follow logic, which means it can't be anticipated or defended against. The discovery that the door was open but not forced introduces a chilling question that creates lasting paranoia. Did someone in the group leave it unlocked? Was there a key? Does the owner have access? Can this happen again elsewhere? This uncertainty, this inability to understand how safety measures failed, makes it impossible to feel secure afterward because you don't know what went wrong or how to prevent it in the future. The group's collective decision to leave immediately represents a rare moment of unified crisis response. When the threat becomes undeniable and immediate, group dynamics can shift rapidly from conflict to cooperation. Everyone's survival instinct overrides social considerations. Nobody cares about being the coward or ruining the trip anymore. The only goal is escape. The aftermath of group trauma is particularly complex. The shared experience should create bonding, and often it does. But it can also create reminders. Seeing the other people who were there can trigger flashbacks, can remind you of your own fear, can make you relive the experience. Some groups grow closer after shared trauma. Others fracture because the association is too painful. The authorities' response, or lack thereof, introduces another layer of psychological impact. When you report a traumatic event and receive minimization or bureaucratic indifference, it creates secondary trauma. It communicates that your experience doesn't matter, that you weren't important enough to protect, that the system designed to keep you safe has failed you. This can be as psychologically damaging as the original trauma itself. The disappearance of the rental listing suggests something even darker. It implies that what happened wasn't an isolated incident, that there's a pattern, that perhaps the location or the owner or both were compromised in some way. But without answers, without official acknowledgement, the victims are left with questions that can never be resolved. This unresolved nature makes the trauma harder to process and integrate. The long-term impact on the group, their avoidance of discussing it, their collective decision to never return to that state, represents a shared coping mechanism. The geographic location becomes a symbol of the trauma. By avoiding it, they're attempting to contain the trauma, to keep it localized, to prevent it from spreading into the rest of their lives. Part 4. Long-term psychological impact and recovery. Now let's discuss what happens after these experiences. How do they change people? What are the lasting effects? And most importantly, how does the brain eventually heal if it does? Post-traumatic stress disorder is the most commonly understood aftermath of home invasion trauma, but it's not the only consequence, and sometimes not even the primary one. PTSD involves intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, avoidance behaviors, and emotional numbing. But home invasion creates specific additional impacts because it violates what should be our safest space. There's a concept in psychology called place attachment. We form bonds with locations where we feel safe, where important life events occur, where we've built memories. Home is the strongest place attachment most people have. When home becomes associated with trauma, this attachment fractures. Some people can never feel safe in that location again. They move, they renovate, they try to change the space to separate it from the memory. Others do the opposite. They stay, they fortify. They try to reclaim the space through asserting control over it. The hypervigilance that develops after home invasion trauma is particularly exhausting because it can't be turned off. Every sound at night becomes a potential threat. Every knock on the door triggers fight or flight. The doorbell ringing creates panic. Delivery drivers are viewed with suspicion. Being home alone, which once felt peaceful or enjoyable, now feels vulnerable and frightening. The brain has learned that home isn't safe, and unlearning that lesson is extremely difficult. Sleep disturbance is one of the most persistent symptoms because sleep requires letting down your guard. Your brain has to believe you're safe enough to lose consciousness. But when home has proven to be dangerous, achieving that belief becomes nearly impossible. The result is chronic sleep deprivation, which compounds all other symptoms. It impairs judgment, increases irritability, decreases immune function, and makes emotional regulation more difficult. Trust is another casualty of these experiences. Trust in authority figures who fail to prevent or resolve the situation. Trust in your own judgment for not recognizing danger sooner or for failing to protect yourself or others. Trust in others to keep you safe. Trust in the basic fairness of the world, the belief that if you follow rules and live quietly, nothing bad will happen to you. That belief, once shattered, is hard to rebuild. There's also survivor's guilt in cases where others were present. Why wasn't I hurt when I could have been? Why didn't I protect others better? Why did I freeze instead of fighting? These questions can create enormous psychological distress even when the person did nothing wrong, even when they responded perfectly to an impossible situation. The hypervigilance often extends beyond the home. People who have experienced home invasion trauma often develop what's called generalized anxiety. They feel unsafe everywhere. Public spaces, friends' homes, hotels, anywhere can become associated with potential danger. This severely limits quality of life, restricts activities, and creates isolation. Recovery from this type of trauma is possible, but it requires specific interventions. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps by teaching the brain to distinguish between current reality and traumatic memory. Exposure therapy, done carefully, can help people reclaim spaces and activities they've been avoiding. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, helps process traumatic memories so they're stored differently in the brain, becoming less intrusive and less emotionally charged. But perhaps most important is validation and support. When survivors' experiences are believed, when their fears are treated as reasonable rather than overreactions, when they're allowed to process at their own pace without judgment, recovery becomes more possible. The people around trauma survivors play a crucial role in their healing. There's also post-traumatic growth, an often overlooked outcome. Some survivors develop increased resilience, deeper appreciation for safety and normalcy, stronger connections with people who supported them, and greater empathy for others who have experienced trauma. They may develop advocacy skills, helping others who have gone through similar experiences. They may discover personal strength they didn't know they had. The key to moving from trauma to growth is integration. The experience becomes part of your story, but not the defining element of your identity. You acknowledge what happened, how it changed you, but you don't let it control your present or future. This is the ultimate goal of trauma recovery, not returning to who you were before, which is impossible, but becoming someone new who's integrated the experience rather than being consumed by it. Conclusion. These stories share common elements that reveal fundamental truths about human psychology and vulnerability. They show us that safety is more psychological than physical, that the feeling of being protected matters as much as actual protection, that when that feeling is destroyed, the impact ripples through every aspect of life. They also reveal that predators understand psychology, consciously or unconsciously. They know how to exploit trust, how to create uncertainty, how to maximize fear while minimizing risk to themselves. Understanding these patterns isn't about creating paranoia. It's about informed awareness, about recognizing warning signs, about trusting instincts even when you can't articulate why something feels wrong. Most importantly, these experiences teach us about resilience. Every person who survived these situations did so through a combination of instinct, action, support, and luck. They made decisions in impossible circumstances. They faced terror and came through it. And while they carry scars, they also carry proof that humans can survive even when safety is shattered. If you or someone you know has experienced home invasion trauma, understand that the psychological impact is real, valid, and deserving of professional support. Recovery is possible, though it takes time and often requires help. You're not weak for being affected. You're human for being traumatized by an inhuman violation of your basic right to feel safe in your own home.